Picture this. A room without time. The curtains are drawn, not out of modesty, but to keep the sunlight from revealing what's left inside. The air is thick with something you can't quite name. Sweat, maybe. Moldavian. Or is it the faint metallic scent of dried blood soaked into linen too old to clean? At the centre of the room lies a boy, a prince, the heir to a global empire. He doesn't move. His sheets are stained. His breath comes in uneven rasps. His lips are cracked and murmuring to no one. His fingers twitch against a crucifix clenched so tightly that the wood has left an imprint on his palm. One eye is open, barely, but it sees nothing. Not the tray of untouched food in the corner, not the servant trembling just outside the door, not the cold stone walls watching in silence. He is 23 years old. His name is Don Carlos, the only son of Philip II, the most powerful monarch in the known world. But he has no crown, no throne, no mourning crowds gathering outside the palace gates, no mother to comfort him, and most chilling of all, no father to speak his name. Instead, what you hear, if you dare press your ear to the wood of that locked chamber, is the sound of silence punctuated by a whimper, a scrape, a prayer, or a scream. Because Don Carlos is dying, not by sword, not by poison, not by divine wrath. He's dying from the inside out, rotting in a room so private, so forbidden, that even the palace guards no longer ask questions. His bones press against skin that has grown grey and papery. His belly is swollen with gas, but he has eaten nothing in days. His legs are covered in open sores. Ulcers ooze red and yellow beneath the silk sheets. A bowl of water sits nearby. He believes it is cursed. He won't drink it. He won't speak. He just stares at something no one else can see. Whispers crawl through the corridors like rats. The prince is cursed. The king has locked him away. He speaks to shadows, cries for saints, begs for his dead mother in Latin. But no one enters. No one dares. Only a single physician is allowed in each morning, and even he doesn't speak when he emerges. He only closes the door, slowly, silently. The rest of the palace moves on. Velvet robes swish in council chambers, masses held in grand chapels, naval plans are drawn for distant wars. Meanwhile, behind a sealed door, the future of Spain rots in real time. Can you imagine the psychological torture of that transformation? To be born into a cradle lined with gold and destined for an empire that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, only to end up in a locked room, whispering to ghosts and chewing your own tongue to silence the voices. Can you picture a father so cold, so careful, that he decides it is better to erase his son from history than let the world see him decay? This is not a myth. This is not metaphor. This is one of the most disturbing truths in royal history. A boy born to rule, a king too proud to be seen weeping, and a death so secret, so shameful, it nearly vanished from the record. He was born to lead a world empire, yet died unseen, unfed, and nearly erased from memory. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you listening from? Have you ever felt forgotten, trapped in a place no one wants to see? And what would you do if your own father condemned you to vanish behind a locked door? Because what you're about to hear isn't just another story of royal madness. It's a mirror held up to power, silence, and the cruel precision of a father's decision. This is the forgotten end of Don Carlos, the child prince who decayed behind velvet curtains, while the world looked the other way. He was born in a cradle carved from ivory and laid beneath a canopy of silk. Trumpets rang out. Cathedrals tolled their bells for hours. In Valladolid, the heart of Spain's power, the people rejoiced. not because a child had entered the world, but because a dynasty had been secured. His name was Carlos, son of Philip II of Spain and Maria of Portugal. The Habsburg line had produced an heir. It was July 8th, 1545. His mother, Maria, was young, beautiful, and royal in both blood and purpose. She had fulfilled her duty, but she would never hold her son again. She died 4 days later. The official word was postpartum complications, but in truth death was an expected guest in dynasties like these. The body of a royal woman was a tool, not a temple. Her function was to reproduce the bloodline, not survive it. Maria had done her part, and now she was gone. So the boy was left motherless in a palace of cold stone, a child who would one day inherit a throne forged in centuries of empire, incest, and expectation. Outside the palace, the world saw celebration. Spain had a prince. Inside, something was already unravelling. The Habsburgs were not just a ruling house, they were a philosophy. They believed in purity of blood, that royal power should remain uncontaminated, contained within itself. But in preserving their divine right, they had created something else entirely. A loop, a genome so interwoven, so repetitively bred, it had begun to collapse on itself. Carlos was the product of this genetic design. His father, Philip II, and his mother were not just cousins, they were double first cousins. Their parents, Carlos's grandparents, were siblings, one family tree, folded back onto itself. At first, no one said anything aloud, not in public, not in court, but palace physicians saw it. Maids whispered of it. Courtiers exchanged glances. Carlos's skull was asymmetrical. His right eye drooped slightly lower than the left. His limbs, even in infancy, moved unevenly. His gait was odd. He tired quickly. His skin bruised easily. His moods changed like wind through a corridor, calm, then thunderous. One day he laughed, the next he screamed. By the age of 5, the signs had multiplied. Fevers came and went. Sudden fits left him shaking and drenched in sweat. Tutors complained of his inability to concentrate, his refusal to follow orders. Sometimes he refused to speak for days. Other times, he wouldn't stop shouting. They called it sensitivity, weak nerves, melancholia. But no one said the word that hung in the air like incense, madness. Because madness in a prince wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a national emergency. To the outside world, however, none of this mattered. Carlos was baptized in a ceremony so grand it echoed across Europe. The font was silver. The priests were robed in gold. Nobles from across the Holy Roman Empire stood in silence as sacred oil was dripped onto the boy's uneven forehead. To the public, he was the embodiment of Spanish destiny, God's chosen heir to the world's most powerful empire. But behind the painted smiles and choreographed blessings, there was a different reality. Carlos's nursemaids rotated constantly. Many requested transfers. One was said to have fled the palace in the middle of the night. His servants developed a code to signal his mood before entering the room. A curtain raised. Calm. A curtain pulled. Proceed with caution. No curtain at all. Do not enter. And yet his father saw in him only legacy, not frailty, not suffering. Philip II was a man of obsessions. He collected maps. He corrected documents in his own hand. He believed God had ordained the Spanish monarchy to rule the world, and his son would continue that plan. What he didn't believe in was failure. So the signs of instability were buried, papered over with silk, ritual, and myth, just as they had always been. Because this wasn't the first Habsburg child to bear the cost of purity. Many had been born with drooling mouths and swollen jaws, with backs that curled unnaturally, with minds that never quite settled. But most were hidden, married off in silence, buried quickly, forgotten. Carlos, however, could not be hidden. He was the only heir. The dynasty had no backup plan. And so, the whispers grew. not just of his fits, but of his blood. Was it possible that the very thing meant to preserve power was the thing that doomed it? Can a bloodline be so pure it becomes poison? The Habsburgs believed they were chosen, but chosen by whom? By God? Or by tradition so blind it refused to see its own reflection? Carlos was no longer just a boy. He was a symbol, a cracked mirror of empire, and with each passing year, that mirror grew more fractured. His body would weaken, his mind would twist, and the same dynasty that celebrated his birth would one day seal him behind a door, never to be seen again. He was raised to be seen, never understood. By age 12, Don Carlos wore armour forged in Toledo steel, engraved with the crest of the House of Habsburg. He attended court sessions beside his father, sat in on council meetings he couldn't comprehend, and bowed with mechanical precision to visiting dignitaries. In portraits, he stood tall, chin lifted, robes heavy with gold thread. His hair was combed into place, his lips pressed into a smile that never reached the eyes. Spain paraded him as the embodiment of divine order, the future king, the living answer to God's favour. But behind closed doors, that armour meant nothing. Carlos could barely sit through a full council session without trembling or snapping at an advisor. His servants knew to remove sharp objects from his chamber before bed. On more than one occasion, a tutor had to flee when Carlos overturned a writing desk in a fit of rage. Once, because a Latin passage dared to mention the word death. He could quote prayers from memory, but he often whispered them to himself in strange rhythms, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. And then there were the animals. They started small. Birds, frogs, lizards, caged, then starved, dissected. One page found a squirrel suspended by its feet, stripped of its fur. Carlos called it his experiment. When asked why, he only smiled and said, "Because it looked at me wrong." At court, these horrors were hidden. The royal image had to be preserved. But servants began leaving. Letters began circulating. By 14, Carlos had become a silent crisis. During a formal banquet in Madrid, a young nobleman seated beside him laughed too loudly at a story. Carlos didn't join in. He picked up a fork and calmly drove it into the boy's hand. The hall fell silent. Blood spilled onto the white linen. Carlos stared at the wound like it was a painting. No punishment followed. No scolding. Only a quiet retreat to his chambers and a fresh set of cutlery the next day. Because who, after all, punishes a prince? His tutors were terrified. Even the most seasoned among them refused to correct his mistakes. They feared not just for themselves, but for what correction might trigger. Carlos had begun speaking of death as if it were a companion. He once asked a priest, "When I die, can I take others with me?" The priest rattled, passed the question to the confessor. The confessor passed it to the bishop to the king. The king said nothing. At Mass, Carlos began muttering aloud. Prayers, yes, but warped. "I am the lamb. I am the knife. I am the altar." He would stop mid-sermon and demand that a statue be removed. "It watches me when I sleep." Other times he refused to kneel, crossing his arms and hissing when the Eucharist approached. The clergy began to sit him apart. Some refused to offer communion at all. By now the rumours had left Spain. Foreign envoys reported back to their courts with growing unease from Italy. The prince's eyes are made of glass, cold and confused, as if he sees a world we cannot. From the Habsburg court in Vienna, he is not fit to rule a dog, let alone a kingdom. From France, there is something in him, dark. We do not speak of it aloud, but in Spain? The official word was unchanged. Carlos was brilliant, devout, prepared. But those who saw him at night, the servants who removed his chamber pot, the pages who folded his robes, knew the truth. He cried for his mother in the dark. He would beg, plead, for her to come take him away. He would scratch at the walls with his nails until they bled, whispering things no one understood. Once, he asked a stable boy if horses could talk. When the boy laughed, Carlos struck him across the face with a riding crop. He didn't stop until the guards pulled him away. There was no affection in his world, no mother, and his father was not a man who held children. Philip II ruled by pen, by paper, by silence. He believed discipline was divine, and in Carlos he saw not a son, but a variable to be controlled. No warmth passed between them, only glances, decrees, and the endless pressure of legacy. So the question lingered, was Don Carlos born mad, or was madness the only language he was ever allowed to speak? What happens when a child is taught to wear a crown before he's taught how to be loved? What happens when the weight of empire replaces the warmth of touch? In Carlos, those answers took shape, not in words, but in screams, in silence, in bloodied hands and empty eyes. He was no longer just a prince. He was becoming something else, not dead, not alive, but a ghost, inside his own skin. It was spring 1562. The marble floors of the royal Alcazar had been freshly polished. A ceremonial procession was set to begin, one of many empty rituals Carlos was required to attend. He walked alone, as usual, flanked by guards who didn't speak to him, servants who barely looked up. Then it happened. A slip, a misstep, a body falling violently down a stone staircase. They say he didn't scream, just thudded one step after another until the back of his skull struck the edge of the final landing with a crack that echoed through the chamber. The guards ran, the servants shrieked, and Don Carlos lay still, blood pooling beneath his right ear. He didn't move for hours. At first they thought he was dead. Then a tremor, a twitch in the leg, a gasp. He was breathing, but barely, and the panic began. The court's most trusted physicians were summoned immediately. But this was 16th century Spain, not modern medicine. The treatments they used had more in common with ritual than science. They placed leeches on his temples. They waved burning herbs under his nose. They whispered prayers. And when nothing worked, they brought the drill, trepanning, a practice as old as civilization itself, where a hole is bored into the skull to release evil spirits or relieve pressure. Carlos was held down, his head was shaved, and the bone was carved open. His screams echoed through the palace halls. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness, his face pale, lips cracked, his words barely coherent. But then, against all odds, he woke. Spain rejoiced, masses were held. Philip ordered Thanksgiving ceremonies across Madrid. The prince had survived, but what woke up was not the same boy. Within weeks, everything changed. Carlos refused to wear shoes. He insisted they were cursed, filled with spirits, cursed leather that burned his feet. He would throw food across the room, accusing the cooks of poisoning him. Even simple bread was suspect. He began collecting objects compulsively: feathers, broken combs, dead flowers, ripped fabric. He hid them beneath his mattress, behind curtains, under his tongue. Birds disappeared from the courtyard. One was found mutilated in his chamber, its head buried beneath his pillow. Carlos said it had been talking too much. He stopped bathing. His hair grew long and oily. He smeared soot across his face and laughed when people stared. He would walk naked through his rooms and hiss at mirrors. One page entered his chamber unannounced and found him crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth, whispering to a crucifix. Another servant later described seeing Carlos licking a cold fireplace stone while sobbing. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "Trying to reach her. She's in the wall." Her? He meant his mother. He called for her constantly now, screamed for her in the night, begged her to come back and take him away. At times, He insisted she was already there, that she sat in the corner, that she watched him while he slept. Servants stopped entering the room alone. One priest, assigned to monitor him, left the palace after just 2 weeks. His only explanation: that boy sees things no man should. Can you imagine what it would mean to survive, but lose yourself forever in the process? To be hailed as a miracle, while your mind dissolves quietly behind royal doors. Don Carlos had always been fragile, but now he was fragmented. He was a cracked portrait, still hung proudly in public, while behind the canvas the paint was peeling into madness. His father, Philip II, didn't visit, not once. Instead, the king ordered increased surveillance, more guards, less contact. Carlos was not offered healing, he was offered distance, control. Because in the mind of a ruler, a broken heir was not a son, he was a threat. And still, the descent continued. Carlos spoke to saints no one could see. He quoted scripture backwards. He tore pages from religious texts and swallowed them whole. He refused to sit in chairs, said they were rigged with nails. He ordered his pillows burned, said they were made of bones. He scratched Latin prayers into the stone floor with broken fingernails. The more he unravelled, the more silent the palace became. Whispers replaced conversation. Guards turned their faces. Maids covered their ears at night. What came next wasn't confinement, it was erasure. The decision had not yet been spoken aloud, but it was growing in the king's mind like rot in a closed room. Carlos had survived the fall, but not the consequence, because in the House of Habsburg, death was preferable to disgrace, and what Philip II could not fix, he would learn to silence. Treason doesn't always come with swords and banners. Sometimes it comes folded in parchment, sealed with a wax ring, and written in the trembling hand of a boy slowly unravelling. In late 1567, Don Carlos began writing letters, desperate letters. They were addressed to Protestant nobles in the Low Countries, men his father, Philip II, considered enemies of the church, traitors to the crown. In these letters, Carlos offered to flee Spain. He spoke of raising an army, of marching against his father. The heir to the Spanish Empire had declared war on the King of Spain, or so it would appear. In truth, Carlos had no army, no allies, no plan, just a broken mind, a shaking hand, and a head full of voices urging him toward one final scream for attention. But the letters were intercepted. When Philip read them, he didn't weep, he didn't shout, he simply closed the letter and called a council. No trial, no hearing, not even a formal accusation, just a room full of men in silence. The doors were locked, the outcome already decided. The prince was no longer a prince, he was a liability. So, Philip, King of Spain, defender of the Catholic faith, ruler of an empire on which the sun never set, chose to become a jailer. And on January 18th, 1568, under cover of night, he led the guards himself. They arrived at Carlos's chambers just after midnight. The boy, thin, sickly, nearly skeletal, was startled from a restless sleep. He stood barefoot on the cold stone floor, eyes wide, hair matted, lips trembling. Philip didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. He simply said, "For your own safety," then turned away. The guards moved in. They removed the curtains first. Too much privacy, they said. Then the tapestries, then the furniture, then his books, his clothes, his writing tools, his servants, even the mirrors. What was left was a stone box, 4 walls, a wooden bed, a chamber pot, and a boy who once might have ruled the world. The windows were sealed. Light was restricted to the hours approved by the guards. He was allowed no fire, no letters, no conversation. His meals were slid through a narrow panel in the door. Most came back untouched. The prince refused to eat. He said the food was cursed. He said it smelled of bones. He said the water spoke Latin. He scratched prayers into the wall with his fingernails. He screamed at invisible saints. He laughed when no one spoke. He wept when no one listened. Guards reported hearing him pacing for hours, muttering, repeating phrases like a litany. I am the lamb. I am the altar. I am the knife. Sometimes he screamed for his mother, begging her to open the door. Other times he accused the stones of betrayal. One night he took the chamber pot and hurled it across the room, spattering the walls with his own filth, then sat cross-legged in the centre of it and whispered, "The devil is watching. Tell the king I see him too." The next day they removed anything not nailed down, and still the king did not visit, not once, not even to check if his son, his only son, was still alive. Philip had made his decision, not as a father, but as a monarch. And so, while the king met with ambassadors, planned military campaigns, and prayed in chapels draped in velvet, Carlos lay in a chamber of silence, his bed soaked in ulcers, urine, and blood, his limbs stiff from lying still, his body wasting away. The guards spoke in whispers. They no longer referred to him by name. Some began crossing themselves before entering his room. Others refused to enter at all. They said he stared through them, that his pupils didn't track movement, that he spoke with voices that weren't there. One wrote in his journal, "He is not dead, but he is no longer alive." Outside, the bells of the cathedral rang for Mass. The Spanish court held feasts and marriages and sermons and executions. Inside that chamber, time had stopped. Carlos, the boy who was supposed to carry the future, had become a secret, an inconvenient ghost. This was not a prison cell, it was a mausoleum, a place for the living dead. And the king, he never broke, he never bent, he never spoke of it again, because in Spain, to speak of the prince was to invite shame, and to speak of madness was to admit the bloodline had cracked. So the silence became doctrine, the locked door became legacy, and behind it, a boy once draped in gold slowly, violently disappeared. There are many ways for a prince to die in war, by assassination, by the slow erosion of a poisoned chalice. But Don Carlos died in silence, alone, in the same locked room where his mind had already slipped away months before. By the spring of 1568, the boy who once wore imperial robes now lay curled beneath a wool blanket soaked in sweat and blood. His body had wasted to little more than bone and skin. His teeth were cracked from grinding. His tongue, coated in thick white film, made even his muttering unintelligible. He hadn't eaten in days. What little food he accepted he claimed was laced with dust ground from human bone. He whispered to his own reflection. He refused to wear clothes. He refused to sleep with the candles out. The guards stopped asking questions. The physician, once summoned daily, now came once a week. Each report grew shorter. Weight decreasing. Mental state unchanged. Refuses water. Skin lesions worsening. Carlos was dissolving, and no one seemed to care. On the night of July 24th, the hallway outside his chamber was quiet. Even the guards by now had stopped posting 2 men at once. There was no reason. The prince barely moved. And then, just before midnight, there was a sound. Not a scream, not a cry, a retching. One long guttural heave, followed by a crash of metal as the chamber pot was knocked over. When the physician was finally summoned, Carlos was convulsing, his limbs stiff, his eyes rolled back, foam at the corners of his mouth. His sheets were red. Not blood exactly, something thicker. His stomach had turned itself inside out. Ice was pressed to his temples, his wrists were bound. But the shaking didn't stop. His final words, if they can be called that, were a slurry of broken Latin, a mix of prayers, curses, and nonsense. He begged for his mother. He accused the priest of being a demon. He asked if he had ever been born. Then he fell silent, and sometime before dawn, the heir to the Spanish Empire, the boy born to rule a world that feared him, was finally still. There were no trumpets, no mourning veils. The death of Don Carlos was announced with a single line in a court bulletin. The most illustrious Don Carlos has succumbed to a long illness. May God receive his soul. That was all. No funeral was held, no crowds were summoned, no statue commissioned. His body, already decomposing by morning, was quickly wrapped in linen and placed in a plain wooden coffin. It was buried in the royal monastery of El Escorial with no inscription. Philip II did not speak of it. He did not attend the burial. He did not send flowers. He did not write his son's name again in any known surviving letter. Don Carlos ceased to exist, not just in life, but in memory. His name was quietly removed from royal documents. Portraits of him were taken down. Commissions bearing his face were halted. Servants were instructed not to mention him. He had become a blank space, a missing thread in the royal tapestry. And yet the world outside Spain did not forget. In Protestant Europe, in England, in the Netherlands, pamphlets began to appear. They painted Carlos not as a madman, but as a martyr, a tragic prince locked away by a fanatical father, a boy silenced by Catholic cruelty. In taverns and salons, whispers grew louder. The king killed his own son. Carlos died for speaking the truth. The crown rotted him from the inside out. Spain denied it all. They called him sick, unstable, unfit, but their silence was louder than any denial. And so, we're left with a question, a haunting, bitter question. Would your father weep at your death? Or would he erase your existence? Would he mourn you, or seal you behind stone and pray the world forgets? Because for Don Carlos there was no weeping, no grave worth visiting, no story told to children, just a locked door, a fading heartbeat, and a legacy scrubbed clean of everything except the smell of rot. What Philip feared was not madness. It was what madness revealed. That the myth of blood, the myth of dynasty, the myth of divinity could crack open like a skull on cold marble. Carlos wasn't just a failure of mind, he was a failure of belief, and that made him dangerous. So he died, without bells, without procession, without forgiveness, but not without meaning. Because in forgetting him, Spain revealed more than any eulogy could, and in remembering him now, we begin to uncover the truth they tried to bury. He wasn't just buried in stone, he was buried in silence. Not the silence of mourning, but the silence of erasure. Because for monarchs, for institutions, for empires built on image and control, fragility is a threat, and threats must be locked away, denied, forgotten. Centuries later, historians, psychiatrists and geneticists would piece together what the Spanish court tried so hard to hide. Don Carlos was not a monster, he was not a traitor, and perhaps he was not even mad, he was ill. Born of a bloodline so tightly knotted that it could no longer breathe. His parents were double first cousins, his grandparents were siblings. The Habsburg jaw, the asymmetrical skull, the violent fits, these weren't signs of sin. They were symptoms of inbreeding, of neurological collapse, of centuries of ignoring what should never have been ignored. Modern analyses suggest Carlos may have suffered from schizophrenia, worsened by trauma, brain injury, malnutrition, and psychological isolation. Conditions that today would require care, therapy, and protection. But in the 16th century, there was no treatment, only walls, and that is where the deeper tragedy begins. Because Carlos was not just a victim of biology, he was a victim of belief, of a monarchy that saw weakness as treason, of a father who ruled with ink and fire but not warmth, of a world that measured value not in humanity, but in function. The palace couldn't help him. because the palace couldn't admit him, and so they sealed the door, not to keep Carlos in, but to keep the truth out. But silence, like rot, doesn't stay buried forever. It seeps, it stains, and eventually it speaks. In the centuries that followed his death, artists began to whisper his name again. They saw in his story something more than failure, something universal. Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright, reimagined Carlos as a tragic hero, noble, idealistic, destroyed by political betrayal. Giuseppe Verdi, the opera composer, gave him a voice in Don Carlo, a man caught between love, duty, and a father who feared his soul. In these fictional versions, Carlos became brave, passionate, worthy of love, but the reality was far crueler. In truth, Carlos died naked, muttering, clawing at the stone floor, not in rebellion, but in confusion, in pain, in utter abandonment, and yet there is something profoundly modern in his suffering. Because even now, 500 years later, we still hide away what we do not understand. We still institutionalize the fragile. We still fear the mentally ill. We still whisper about those who scream in the dark instead of listening. Carlos is not just a figure from Spain's past. He is a mirror, held up to every locked ward, every child dismissed as too difficult, every story the system refused to carry. He forces us to ask, what happens to people who don't fit? Not just in court, but in society, in family, in history. What happens when care is replaced with control? When fear is dressed in velvet and passed off as duty? Carlos didn't need a throne. He didn't need an empire. He needed someone to stay, to sit beside him, to say, "You are not a disgrace." But that kind of love doesn't serve dynasties. It doesn't keep maps filled. It doesn't write legacy. So the most powerful monarchy in the world let a child rot behind a door. Because love was inconvenient. And yet, even in his decay, Carlos mattered. Because in remembering him, we uncover the parts of history not written in books, but in screams, cracked fingernails, and locked doors. His suffering wasn't just a consequence of illness. It was the result of a system that couldn't tolerate imperfection. And that makes him dangerously human. He became a legend, not because he ruled, but because his very existence questioned the myth of royal infallibility. A prince who cracked the mask, who made the empire flinch, who showed that beneath the gold was flesh, was blood, was madness, was truth. So yes, they buried him in silence, but centuries later, that silence speaks louder than any crown, because it asks us not to look at Carlos as a failure, but as a warning of what happens when power fears pain, of what is lost when we refuse to listen. Thank you for staying through his story. Not everyone did. But maybe now, he's not as forgotten as they hoped.